The box was sitting at the end of the driveway when I came home from my walk. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the air smelled like wet leaves and cold pavement. I had been gone 40 minutes. I walked the same route every morning down Sycamore, past the elementary school, back up the hill, because Douglas used to walk it with me, and now I walk it alone. And I think that is its own kind of keeping faith. The box was one of those brown moving boxes, sealed with packing tape, sitting at the curb beside the recycling bin. My neighbor's truck was pulling out and he slowed and gave me a look. I didn't understand yet. I set down my travel mug and opened the flap. Douglas's fishing tackle. His logbook with the green cover. The small brass compass he kept on the bookshelf since 1987. The one I used to straighten every morning without thinking about it. I stood at the curb with the compass in my hand, and I did not make a sound. I had let them into my home 8 months earlier, because I believed that is what family does. I want to tell you how it got to that moment, because I think you may have a box of your own somewhere. My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 68 years old. I live in Kingston, Ontario, in the house where I raised my daughter Claire. The house where I planted the crabapple tree in the backyard the summer she was born. The house where Douglas and I spent 31 years of a good and ordinary life together. I taught elementary school for 34 years. I was a reading specialist for the last 12 of those years, which means I spent my career helping children find language for things they could not yet say. I know something about patience. I know something about watching carefully and waiting for the right moment to speak. Douglas died of a stroke in the spring of 2019. He was 63 years old. We had plans for that autumn. We had talked about driving out to Cape Breton. Those plans are still in a notebook in my bedside drawer, and I have not thrown that notebook away. And I do not intend to. I am the kind of woman who does not ask for help until she has tried everything else first. I kept the furnace running. I kept the gutters clean. I learned to do the taxes myself. My neighbors used to ask if I was all right, and I would say yes. Because I was, because being all right and being sad are not mutually exclusive. And I had learned to hold both. That same quality, the self-sufficiency, the not tasking, made it very easy for someone to take and never be asked to stop. My daughter, Claire, is 39 years old. She is sharp and funny in a way that used to make Douglas laugh until his eyes watered. She has his laugh too, which is a mercy and an ache at the same time. She met Derek when she was 34. He was working in project management for a construction firm, organized the way certain men are organized, a place for everything. Everything in its place, a slight impatience with anyone who operates differently. I noticed that about him early. I noticed it, and I set it aside, because I had also seen the way he looked at my daughter when she talked, as though he was genuinely interested in what she was going to say next. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Their wedding was in June of 2019. Douglas had been gone 8 weeks. I wore a blue dress, and I danced with my grandson Tyler, who was 5. And at one point I stepped outside alone and stood in the parking lot and let myself feel both things at once, the gladness and the missing. Then I went back in, and I danced again. Derek toasted me at the reception. He said I was a woman of remarkable grace. I believed he meant it. I want to be clear about that. I still believe he meant it, in the way that people mean things before they are tested by proximity and money and time. The first small signal came at Christmas that year. Derek mentioned that the living room was a little crowded with furniture. Douglas's armchair, the brown leather one he had bought at an estate sale in 2003. The one he sat in every evening. The one that still held the slight impression of where he used to lean, was apparently in the way of a better traffic flow. He said it pleasantly. He said it once, and moved on. I told myself, he was just making conversation. The request came in February of 2023. 3.5 years after the wedding. Claire called on a Sunday evening. Her voice had that particular softness she uses when she wants something she is not sure she should want. Mom, we've had a setback with the house in Belleville. The closing fell through. We have nowhere to go for a while, and the lease is up in 30 days. She paused. We were wondering if we could stay with you. Just for a few months. For months at the most. Tyler needs stability. Tyler was 8 by then. Tyler, who looked like Douglas around the eyes, and who used to ask me to read to him every single visit. That was the word she had used. Stability. She knew exactly where to place it. I said yes because I loved my daughter. I said yes because I loved that little boy. I said yes, because the house had 4 bedrooms, and Douglas had been gone for 4 years, and the space had started to feel less like peaceful, and more like empty. And I said yes because I had raised Claire largely alone after my own mother's illness consumed our savings and our plans. And I had held the family together then. And holding the family together is what I know how to do. I put fresh sheets on the guest room. I cleared the second bathroom. I moved a few things to make room. I should have written the terms down. I know that now. But I didn't, because you do not write a contract with your own child. The first change was the kitchen. Derek was a man who cooked, which I genuinely appreciated at first. But within 2 weeks he had rearranged the spice cabinet, everything alphabetical. Which sounds reasonable, until you realize that the coffee is not a spice, and yet it had been moved as well. And the small ceramic jar Claire had painted for me in 2nd grade, the one that sat on the counter next to the stove, had been placed in the back of the cabinet because it wasn't being used. I moved it back. I said nothing. I moved it back. The second change was the dining room. Derek mentioned that the lighting was not ideal for evening meals, and asked if they could hang a different fixture. I said I preferred to keep the one I had. It was a simple globe. Nothing remarkable, but Douglas had installed it himself, and I had watched him do it. Derek nodded. The following Saturday I came home from errands and the old fixture was in the garage, and a new one, brushed nickel, very modern, was hanging in its place. When I mentioned it, Derek said he had assumed my hesitation was just habit, not a real objection. I stood in the dining room and looked at the ceiling, and I thought, he genuinely believes that was somehow worse. The third change was Douglas's armchair. I came downstairs one morning, and the chair was not in the living room. I stood in the doorway for a moment, very still. I found it in the basement, against the wall near the furnace. Still with the small tartan blanket folded over the arm, the one Douglas used to pull over his knees when he was reading in winter. Derek had put it down there, he explained, because he and Claire had ordered a sectional, and there simply wasn't room. He said it as though this were a logistical observation rather than a decision that should have involved me. I carried the armchair back upstairs myself. It took me 3 trips on the stairs, and I had to rest at the landing. I put it back in its corner. I smoothed the tartan blanket. I sat in it for a moment, and I looked at the room. I said nothing to Derek, but something in me had begun to calculate. The fourth change was the guest calendar. Derek began scheduling the guest room, my 2nd bedroom, the one with the window seat for his work colleagues who came through Kingston. He mentioned it after the first one had stayed 2 nights, as a courtesy, not as a question. When I said I would prefer to be consulted, he nodded with the kind of careful patience that implied I was being unreasonable but that he was choosing to be gracious about it. The 5th change was the backyard. The crabapple tree had stood in the right corner since 1988. Every spring it bloomed in this particular pale pink. And every autumn I collected the small fruit, and made jelly and gave it to people I loved. Derek decided the tree blocked the sightline from the kitchen window, and asked if I had ever considered removing it. I said no. He brought it up again 2 weeks later, this time mentioning that a landscaping crew could do it quickly and cheaply. I said, very calmly, that tree was planted the year my daughter was born. He said, I know, Margaret. I just think the yard has more potential. I went into the kitchen and washed the morning dishes, and I thought, potential. As though the yard were a project, as though the yard were his dot. I came home on that Tuesday in October, and found the box at the curb. The tackle, the logbook, the brass compass. There were other things in the box too. A small framed photograph that had been on the bookshelf in the study. Douglas and me, at Algonquin Park, in 2012. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be an old grocery list in Douglas's handwriting, which I had kept in the desk drawer, because it was in Douglas's handwriting. A wooden-handled pocket knife. Derek had been reorganizing the study to use it as a home office. He had, apparently, judged these items to be clutter. I carried the box inside. I set it on the kitchen table. I picked up the compass and I held it in both hands, and I felt the weight of it, the cold metal warming slightly in my palms, and something that had been moving in me for 8 months went very still. I did not cry. I did not call out to anyone. I set the compass down on the kitchen table, not in the box. On the table, and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I looked at my hands. The crabapple tree was still in the yard. I could see it from the window, almost bare now, just a few pale leaves holding on. It had survived 35 winters. It had survived the ice storm of 2013 that took 3 trees on our street. It was still there, I thought. So am I, and I knew what I was going to do. I drove to my lawyer's office the next morning. Her name is Susan, and I have known her for 20 years, and I had called ahead, and she had cleared an hour. I sat across the desk from her, and the morning light came in through the blinds in long pale stripes, and I told her everything in order. I did not dramatize it. I gave her the facts. She listened with a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she wrote things down. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "What do you want to do, Margaret?" I told her. She drafted the letter that afternoon. A formal notice. They had 30 days to vacate the property. The house was mine, purchased in 1991, paid off in 2009, never transferred to any other party, and no informal arrangement changed that fact by 1 degree. My hand was slightly unsteady when I signed the letter. I noticed that, and I let it be. Being slightly unsteady and being resolved are not the same thing, and they are not opposites either. That evening I called my friend, Vera. We have been friends since our children were in nursery school together. And Vera is the kind of person who listens before she responds, which is rarer than it sounds. I told her what I had done. There was a pause. She said, "Good." That single word. She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. I held the phone and I looked at Douglas's armchair across the room, back in its corner, where it belonged. And I felt something I can only describe as becoming slightly less heavy, not light. Not yet, but less heavy. That was enough. The letter arrived at the house by courier 2 days later. I was in the kitchen when Derek opened it. I heard the silence before I heard anything else. He came into the kitchen holding the letter. And his face had done something I had not seen it do before. The organization, the pleasantness, the careful management, it had all gone somewhere, and what was underneath it was cold and tight. He said, "This is a joke." I said, "It isn't." He said, "You are going to do this to your daughter." To Tyler. Because of a chair. I want to be honest with you about what I did not say. I did not say, it was never about the chair. I did not say, you have been dismantling this house piece by piece and calling it improvement. I did not say, Douglas built a life in these rooms, and you put it at the curb like it was garbage. I said, you have 30 days, Derek. That's a generous amount of time. He stood there. He looked at me the way people look when they have finally realized the person across from them is not going to move. Then he took his phone out and went upstairs. I heard him speaking to Claire, his voice low and fast. Claire called my cell phone from upstairs, which struck me as a particular kind of strange, calling me while inside my house. She said, "Mom, we need to talk about this." Her voice was careful. I sent her to voicemail. Then I went into the living room and I sat in Douglas's chair, and I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. There is a cost to being right. I want to say that plainly. The weeks after the letter were the loneliest I had felt since the first winter after Douglas died. Claire was not speaking to me beyond short, careful texts. Derek was coldly civil in the way that some people use civility as punishment. And Tyler did not understand any of it. And he would come and find me in the kitchen, and stand near me without quite knowing why. And once he climbed into my lap, the way he hadn't done since he was 5. And I held him, and I breathed through it. He left with them when they moved to a rental in December. He waved from the car window. That was the moment I nearly called it back. That small hand in the window, and his face, Douglas's eyes, looking at me. I stood at the front door and I held the door frame, and I thought about all the things Derek had put at the curb. And I stayed where I was. My friend Vera came that Saturday with lemon cake and a bottle of wine. She said was too expensive but that the occasion required. We sat at my kitchen table, and we ate cake and she told me about her own difficult year, and we laughed a few times, which I had not done in longer than I wanted to admit. I cried once, just briefly, and Vera refilled my glass and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly right. I put the brass compass back on the bookshelf, where it had always been. I put the photograph from Algonquin Park back on the shelf beside it. I smoothed the tartan blanket over the arm of the armchair. I put Douglas's grocery list back in the drawer. It is now May. Claire came for dinner 3 weeks ago. Without Derek, she sat at the kitchen table the way she used to sit at the kitchen table as a teenager, slightly sideways in the chair, both hands around her mug. She didn't apologize. I was not waiting for an apology. What she said was, I should have stopped it sooner. She said it looking at the table, not at me. I poured her more tea. I said, "You're here now." It was not everything. But it was real, and I have learned to value what is real over what is complete. Tyler comes on Saturdays now. He is reading chapter books on his own, and he likes to sit in Douglas's armchair with his feet tucked underneath him, which is exactly how Douglas used to sit, and which I do not mention because some things are better simply witnessed. Last Saturday he asked me who the man in the Algonquin Park photograph was. I told him it was his grandfather. He looked at the photo for a long moment. He said, "He looks nice." I said, "He was." The brass compass is on the bookshelf. The armchair is in its corner. The crabapple tree bloomed early this year, the palest pink, the whole right side of the yard. I watched it from the kitchen window, and I thought of planting it 35 years ago. With a baby on my hip, and a whole life in front of me, it is still here, so am I. I want to speak to you directly now, because I think some of you know exactly what I am describing. Not the specifics, but the feeling. The feeling of watching your own home become unfamiliar. The feeling of softening your voice, and shrinking your space, and telling yourself, it's generosity when it has long since stopped being generosity. The feeling of standing in a room that is yours, and wondering, somehow, if you are allowed to be in it. There is a particular kind of erosion that happens not through cruelty, but through assumption. The assumption that you will accommodate. The assumption that your preferences are habits, and your grief is sentiment, and your silence is consent. It moves slowly. It moves in increments. And it is easy to miss because each increment, taken alone, seems so small. But they accumulate. What I want you to know is this: the moment you see the whole picture clearly, that moment of clarity is not the beginning of a battle. It is the end of a confusion. You already knew. You simply had not yet said so out loud. Your home is not just a structure. It is the accumulated record of your life, who you loved, what you built, who you are when no one is managing your reactions. You are allowed to protect it. Not in anger. Not in retaliation. In the same quiet, steady way you have done every difficult thing. By simply doing what needs to be done. The crabapple tree survives the winter, not by fighting the cold. It survives by being, root deep exactly what it is. You have survived harder things than this. And you are still exactly what you are. A home is just a building until someone loves it into meaning. And you are allowed to be the one who decides what that meaning is. In the weeks after Derek and Claire moved out, I walked through the house differently than I had in months. Not with relief exactly. Relief is too simple a word for what I felt. It was more like relearning a language I had been forbidden from speaking. I touched the door. I stood in the middle of rooms. I rearranged nothing, because nothing needed rearranging. Everything was already where it belonged. I noticed things I had stopped noticing while they were here. The way the afternoon light comes through the front window and lands in a long, warm stripe across the hardwood floor at exactly 3 o'clock. Douglas used to call it the reading light. He would move his chair to follow it across the room, the way a cat follows the sun. I had not thought about that in 8 months. Standing there that first quiet afternoon, watching that stripe of light move slowly across the floor. I felt him in the room, in a way I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. That is what I had not expected. The grief underneath the grief. I had been so busy managing my reactions, managing my space, managing the slow steady loss of my own house, that I had stopped grieving Douglas properly. Derek's reorganizing had pushed Douglas's things to the edges, and then off the edges entirely. And I had been so focused on what was being taken, that I had not fully recognized what that taking had cost me beyond the practical. It had cost me the quiet communion with my husband that I had built into the fabric of my daily life. The compass on the shelf, the chair in the corner, the grocery list in the drawer. These were not clutter. These were conversation. A way of continuing to speak to someone I could no longer reach by any other means. When I put the compass back on the shelf, I held it for a moment, before setting it down. I said, out loud, to no one who was physically in the room, still here, Douglas, I do not think that is strange.